Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Traceability webinar. My name is Radoika Britsky, and I'll be your presenter today. So I hope that you're looking at my deck, the one I'm sharing, and I will shut my video to start the presentation. Thank you for participating, and let's start the presentation. So before we get started, just a few logistic notes. Everyone will be in listen-only mode. We will have a QA question or session at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions, put them in the question box, as I will answer them at the end of the webinar. If we don't get through all the questions, I will follow up via email to get those answers for you. This webinar is being recorded, and we will emailing you the recording tomorrow. So a little bit about myself. My name is Radoika Britsky, and I have been a quality and food safety professional for over 20 years before I came to SCS. I worked in food manufacturing, and I have been training for the past 5 years. Today, I will be talking about the new traceability rule that entered in effect on November 15, 2022. So a little bit about SCS and its background. SCS is an international leader in third-party food safety, environmental, and sustainability certification, as well as standards development. We specialize in auditing, certification, verification, training, life cycle assessment, and strategic consulting. We have over 24,000 clients with more than 38 years of experience. We are auditors in all major markets, and we have provided more than 30,000 certifications around the world. These are some samples of food and agricultural service offered. So we do have training and consulting in food safety, responsible sourcing advisory and verification services, carbon services, food safety audits on all major GFSI standards, HACCP-based related certifications and audits. And also we offer services in food labeling, such as gluten-free, USDA organic, and sustainable agriculture, such as Equitable Food Initiative, Fair Trade USA, Rainforest Alliance, and others. So before anything due, let's start with the webinar for traceability. So the FDA has defined food traceability as the ability to follow the movement of a food product and its ingredients through all steps in the supply chain, both backward and forward. So this is nothing new to us. This has been the definition of traceability since the regulations have been implemented. And it's the methodology that we currently follow. If you're a GFSI certified facility, this is the methodology that you follow when you do your traceability exercises and you have to demonstrate traceability. So why are we really here? So as I mentioned in the prior slide, traceability has existed for a few decades now, but there is a new rule that has been established. And as I mentioned earlier as well, the rule was effective November 15 this year, okay? So the reason for this is because the FDA has learned that one step up and one step back record keeping requirements do not capture all the data elements necessary to effectively and rapidly link shipments of food through each point in the supply chain. So among of the significant gaps that they have identified in these requirements are the lack of coverage of all sectors involved in food production, distribution, and sale. So for example, farms and restaurants that are exempt. The lack of uniform data collection, for example, regarding the source of food ingredients used in each lot of finished product, or no requirement to record a lot code or other identifier for all foods. And lastly, the inability to link incoming product with outgoing product within a firm and from one point in the supply chain to the next. So because of these learning experiences throughout the last few recalls in the last few years, that's why we're here. The FDA has established a new regulation because these shortcomings have hindered FDA outbreak investigations in many ways, including by making it more difficult to obtain tracing information from point of service firms that are exempt from the regulation itself. Even when such information is available, they have found that the records required under the regulation were often inadequate to facilitate a rapid and accurate traceback through the distribution chain to the producer of a contaminated food. As a result, the FDA has taken the initiative to revise the regulation and implement a traceability rule that will help the FDA rapidly and effectively identify recipients of those foods to prevent or mitigate foodborne illnesses outbreaks and address credible threats and serious adverse health consequences or death. The final rule is designed to facilitate faster identification and rapid removal of potentially contaminated food from the market, resulting in fewer foodborne illnesses and death. So this is if as is being or is seen in the rule. Everything in the traceability rule covers from farm to fork, and also they have been the introduction of the seafood with the introduction of the fishing vessel and forward as it is presented in this slide. Okay. So who is covered by the rule? So anyone that manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods in the food traceability list, that anyone that touches the whole supply chain from farm and facilities to retail food establishment, both foreign and domestic. It also applies to foreign and domestic food businesses. And there are, of course, some exemptions and partial exemptions in the rule. Now, this list was created by performing a risk assessment based on the following factors: frequency of outbreaks and occurrence of illness, severity of the illness, likelihood of contamination, the potential for pathogens growth with consideration of shelf life, manufacturing process contamination, probability and industry-wide intervention, consumption rate and amount consumed, and cost of the illness. So this list was created taking into account all these factors, and you can actually go into the FDA website and take a look at the whole assessment that they have performed and the tool that they use to perform this risk assessment. So if you are part of this list, you are covered by the rule. And again, there are some exemptions that the regulators have applied to the rule as well. Now, it is important to notice that those businesses affected are the ones involved in the supply chain with the food as it is described in the list. So for example, if you are a distributor of cucumbers, fresh cucumbers, you most likely fall into this rule, okay? But if you are, let's say, distributing or processing frozen leafy greens, you might not fall on the rule, or you may have certain exemptions, okay? Another example is if I harvest tomatoes, these are considered fresh, and therefore the rule requirements apply to me. So, but if I now process the tomatoes, that is not on the list, and I might be exempt based on the regulation requirements. Now, the FDA has established that they will be updating the list approximately every 5 years. So you need to be attentive as to any updates on the list, as you might have to modify your traceability program requirements to adjust to the new list. Once the updated list it's done or is achieved, they will publish a food registry notice to allow for public comments. And once the window for public comments is completed, it will take, and they will take any modifications as needed based on the feedback and proceed to publish the revised list. Now, this process of publishing the list and gathering comments, it might take anywhere between 6 months to a year and up to 2 years. So again, you just need to be really connected with the FDA to be sure that you are in compliance in case the list changes. Now, once there is an addition of an item to the food traceability list, they will allow the business 2 years to reach full compliance. Okay? Now, the FDA has determined that it takes approximately 35 days to find the source of the hazard when a traceability log code has not been applied, versus an average of 6 days when the traceability log code has been applied. Therefore, they have made mandatory that a traceability log code is used at some of the critical tracking events or stages of the supply chain. A source reference can be assigned to the traceability log code, and this is called the traceability log code source reference. The traceability log code, or TLC, source reference is a method for giving the FDA access to the traceability log code source location description required under the rule without providing the actual information directly to subsequent recipients. This was done just to keep the privacy of the businesses. To protect the confidentiality of business information, for example, a shipper could choose to provide its customers with the TLC source reference instead of directly identifying the location description of the TLC source of at a food traceability list food that they handle. Okay, examples of the traceability log code source reference types may include, but are not limited to, for example, a facility registration number. Okay. Now, the rule have identified critical tracking events. So what are really critical tracking events? So a critical tracking event are activities performed by different businesses within the food supply chain and that have been identified by the FDA as key points of the supply chain that need to provide information. So here in this slide, I'm presenting the critical tracking events that have been identified by the FDA under the new food traceability rule. So we have harvesting, which applies to farms and farm mix type facilities and means activities that are traditionally performed on farms for the purpose of removing raw agricultural commodities or RACs from the place they are grown or raised and preparing them for use food. Cooling refers or means active temperature reduction of raw agricultural commodities using hydrocooling, icing, forced air cooling, vacuum cooling, or a similar process. And this refers to cooling before initial packing. Initial packing refers to a raw agricultural commodity other than a food obtained from a fishing vessel for the first time. The first land receiver is the person taking possession of a food for the first time on land directly from a fishing vessel. Receiving critical tracking events, it's an event in a food supply chain in which a food is received by a customer other than a consumer at a defined location after being transported by truck or ship from another defined location. Shipping is the transportation of food from one location to another, and transformation is changing of any food in the food traceability list, including its package or label. For example, peanut butter cookies is a good example. So these are the definitions that the FDA has provided for all these events in the supply chain. Now, along with the new the definitions and clarifications on critical tracking events, they have defined key data elements. So at the core of this rule, there is a requirement for those who manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods in the food traceability list to establish and maintain records containing key data elements associated with different critical tracking events. In other words, key data elements are required information that needs to be included in the documentation that will be either retained or provided to the next step in the supply chain. The list of required documentation is really extensive for each critical tracking event, so I will not cover it really in this webinar, but these records that are required at each critical tracking event will need to contain a link to the key data elements to the traceability code or traceability lot code, TLC. Now, of course, under the rule, you will be required to have a documented traceability plan. And perhaps you have a plan, existing plan, you may have to review it if you fall under the food traceability list. So what is it covered in this traceability plan, or what needs to be included? You need to include the description of the procedures you use to maintain the required records, including the format and location of the records. You also need to include the description of the procedures you use to identify foods on the food traceability list that you manufacture, process, pack, or hold. A description on how you assign traceability lot codes to foods on the food safety traceability list, if applicable. A statement of identifying a point of contact for questions regarding your traceability plan and records. Now, this point of contact can just be a title and a phone number, and this has been done to keep confidentiality of the people working at the facilities. If you grow or raise a food in the food traceability list other than X, a farm map showing the areas in which you grow or raise such foods must be included in the traceability plan. The farm map must show the location and name of each field or other growing area in which you grow a food in the food traceability list, including geographic coordinates and any other information needed to identify the location of each field or growing area. For aquaculture farms, the farm map must show the location and name of each container, let's say a pond, a pool, a tank, or a cage, in which you raise seafood on the food traceability list, including the geographic coordinates and any other information needed to identify the location of each container. You must also update your traceability plan as needed to ensure that the information reflects your current practices and to ensure you are in compliance with the rule. And you must retain your prior traceability plan for 2 years after you update the plan. Now, as any regulation, you will be required to keep records, and records are required for foods in the traceability food list. Foods that contain foods in the traceability list, provided that the food remains in the same form as it is listed. So for example, if I'm adding fresh tomatoes to a salad, then the new food will require the applicable records under the regulation. Records must be maintained as original paper or electronic records or true copies, and they all must be legible and stored to prevent deterioration or loss. Electronic records may include valid working electronic links to the information required to maintain to be maintained under the rule. All records required under this rule, along with any information required to understand the records, must be available to the FDA within 24 hours after a request is made or within a reasonable time to which the FDA has agreed. Unless exempt from this requirement, an electronic sortable spreadsheet containing relevant traceability information must be provided to the FDA within 24 hours of a request or within some reasonable time to which the FDA has agreed. When necessary, to assist the FDA during an outbreak, recall, or other threat to the public health. Now, of course, as any other rule that they have been under FSMA, there are some exemptions, and as you can see, these exemptions are really extensive, and I'm not gonna cover them on this webinar. But you have exemptions for farms, commingled raw agricultural commodities, fishing vessels, molluscs and shellfish, retail food establishments and restaurants, certain type of processing, personal consumption holding food or individual consumers, and some others that are, for example, produce listed as a rarely consumed raw of foods regulated by the USDA or transported of food, etc. Again, I will not cover these exemptions at the moment because it's very extensive and it will take more than just a few minutes to cover. So the question now is how to be in compliance. How, if I am a business that fall into the food traceability list, or I will be receiving a food in the food traceability list or traceability food list, how can I get compliance? So what is next? So the first thing is that you need to identify if you're part of the food traceability list. That is a simple step. Or if you will be receiving a food under the food traceability list. So where do you fall in the supply chain? Once you identify where you fall in the supply chain process, then you can see where you are in the defined critical tracking event. So you might be a transformation CTE, maybe you are a receiving CTE, maybe you are a shipping CTE. So once you understand where you fall into the supply chain and define your CTE, you will have to assess whether you need to assign a traceability log code to your food or if it's not applicable for your CTE. Then you need to identify the information or key data elements that you need to include in your documentation. Of course, put all these together and develop and implement a traceability program. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have a traceability program, you need to review it if you fall into these supply chain CTEs to see what you need to modify and provide the information to your customers as needed. You don't need to provide all the information to your customers. For example, harvesters do not need to provide the map of the farm. Now, the implementation deadline is January 20, 2026. And although I would say that the deadline is 3 years away, it is important that you start communicating with your suppliers and customers now. It seems that 3 years is a long time to get compliant, but given the fact that this is a new rule, everybody needs to become familiar with the requirements and understand what is it required of you and what would it be required from your suppliers and what your customers will require from you as well. Okay, so you will need information, as I mentioned just now, from them. And you need to provide that information to your customers as well. So you need to become very familiar with the rule and start implementing processes that you perhaps don't have at the moment at your facilities. You might also need to assess whether your suppliers need help in establishing their key data elements that need to be supplied to you. You might be a company that is a business that has smaller suppliers, so you may need to assist them in that knowledge and work with them so they understand what needs to be supplied to you. So 3 years, it's, again, it seems a long time, but when it comes to implementation of a new rule that has a lot of new concepts and elements, is not so far-fetched to have 3 years for implementation. Now, for now, the FDA will be acting as educators when they inspect the facilities affected by the new rule, but they also have announced that they will go in full-blown inspection mode at the time of the deadline and thereafter. So as of January 2026, they will not be educators anymore. They will not guide you. They will not be understanding. They will actually enforce the regulation. So implementation planning has already begun at the FDA. So my recommendation is that don't wait last minute for you to assess whether you need changes in your traceability program, or if you need to implement, if you don't have one, a traceability program for your facilities. So be sure that you are in compliance early. And again, do not wait until the last minute to be in compliance. As a result of this new, and as leaders in the training community, XCS Global Services will be launching a traceability workshop that is designed to help navigate the intricacies of the rule that could not be discussed during this webinar. And we will include a hands-on exercises to help our customers understand where they stand in the supply chain. So this concludes our presentation, and I will be taking questions now. So I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll come on camera and check if we had questions. Okay, these are good questions. Hold on. Is cheese made from non-dairy ingredients covered by the rule? So again, they are very specific as to what is covered by the rule. However, just because you don't see your cheese category listed in the food traceability list, that doesn't mean that you fall at some point on as part of the supply chain that requires certain key data elements. For example, let me give you an example. If you are making a plant-based cheese and you are receiving raw agricultural commodities that are in the as fresh and they are in the food traceability list, you need to identify what KDEs, what key data elements they need to supply to you. And if you need to keep that traceability lot code that has been supplied to you, okay? Or if you need to develop one. So I hope that answered your question. I don't see ice cream on the food traceability list. Is that still in scope? Again, if you're not in the food traceability list, you might be exempt from the rule. But if you're receiving any of the food traceability elements or items in the food traceability list, you will fall under the rule either as a receiver, right? As a receiver of that food as it is expressed in the traceability rule. Okay, I don't see ice cream being part of that unless there is something that you're putting in the ice cream that I'm not aware of that is part of the list. But again, you need to, and we'll help you in that workshop that we will be developing to determine whether you fall or not, and if you need something from the receiving standpoint. So not all fruits are covered. Does the FDA provide a list of what is? Let's see. what is covered. Yeah, so the list or what is considered a tropical tree fruit. So yes, they'll have a little bit more detail on that. And again, it all depends on the exemptions that they have, which I didn't cover here. Does the melons group include watermelons? I'm not sure. I will have to get back to you on that. So I know that melon in a specific, it was assessed as a risk because of the big recall of the melons that we had in the past. And so that's part of why they are in the food traceability list. But I'll have to get back to you on the watermelon specifically. Does this rule apply to fresh fruit juice? Again, if you are a processor, right, that falls into most likely the transformation CTE. And as a processor, you need now to identify whether you are receiving this fruit as raw agricultural commodities and process them and transforming them in your facility, or if they're coming in a different form that is transformed. Again, this is part of the exemption of the rule. For example, one of the exemptions is that if I receive a product that is considered quote unquote raw and I am applying a kill step, I might be exempt under the rule. Okay. If you make peanut butter, you create, but if you have an ingredient with a kill step, that's transformation. Yes, again, there are a lot of exceptions that they have made, and I didn't cover them in this webinar, but I will be covering them in detail during the workshop that we're going to launch in January 31st. And as I mentioned with the earlier question, if you're receiving a raw agricultural commodity and you're doing a kill step, you might not fall under the rule. You might be part of the exemptions. Do you have to add fishing location to the label like the European Union? Example for, I will get back to you on that. I did not read anything in the rule that is regarding to the fishing location. Most of the weight falls on the first land receiver. So the first land receiver that is taking the basically seafood from the vessel, the fishing vessel, need to identify the trace load code that requires information of the company that they are receiving the fish from. Is there any way other than barcodes that the information can be covered to the next level of the supply chain? Again, barcodes is what it has been used traditionally to assign lot codes. But if you do have the information that is easily interpreted by anyone that is, reading your records, and it's easy to trace to the source, lot code the barcode is not necessarily the only means that you have for traceability. Yes, we're going to send the presentation or the recordings tomorrow. The question is, will there be a link downloaded to your presentation? We at Tequila Factory, for us, applied the new rule. Let's see. So again, if you are making alcohol from a raw agricultural commodity, you might fall under the rules if that raw agricultural is in the food traceability list and it's fresh. Okay, so if your ingredient that you use to make tequila, to transform into tequila, might not be on the list, then you don't fall under the rule, you're exempt. So the next question is there a format or template for a foreign supplier verification program reading plan? If not, how will we structure that document, and where will we find a list of all information that should be included? So again, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, the rule applies for domestic and foreign companies that are processing food, and those foreign companies that are bringing them to the US. And those foreign companies fall under the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. So you should have currently a plan. I do not have a template because the rule does not establish a particular template that you need to follow to prepare this foreign supplier verification plan. But the way that you will be covered is by including those key data elements that you will need at the time of importing your products into the US and distributing them into the US. That's how you modify your foreign supplier verification program to fit the traceability rule. If we're certified Primos GFS, can this give us confidence that we are compliant with the traceability rule? No, no. The FDA is very specific as to what they require in the regulations, and just because you have a GFSI certification or similar certification, that doesn't grant that you're meeting the rule. Again, this is a question here from, I believe, the tequila. So fresh fruit juice that is turned into alcoholic beverage. Again, if you are receiving any components from the fruit traceability list that is categorized as fresh, and you're making that alcoholic beverage, you might fall under the rule. If we do receive and ship, we already have lots, but it's our customers' products. Again, as a shipper and as a receiver and shipper, so you might fall under the distribution CTE. I don't know your business in detail. It's really hard for me to tell from the question, but you might fall into the distributor CTE. And if you are a distributor or a shipping and receiving or distributor in the supply chain, you may have key data elements that apply to receiving and key data elements that apply to shipping. Okay, so again, I'll be expanding more on the workshop. And the documentation is requirements is a little bit extensive. I heard in another webinar that the start of the FDA rule is January 20th, 2023, and we have until, correct. So it is in effect already, okay? The rule is in effect. However, they will not be enforcing any actions against the rule until January 20th, 2026. That is the deadline that everybody has to provide proof of implementation. In the meantime, what the FDA is going to do is that they come to your facility and you fall or you're covered under the rule, they will guide you and they will educate you regarding the rule. They are not going to consult with you, but they will let you know that the rule and what kind of perhaps elements you need or you are missing in your traceability process. Okay. Where can I find the trade food list? The food trace list can be found on the FDA website. We only have documents from when we receive and ship. Is that fine or we need more? Again, each CTE or critical tracking event needs its set of documentations called key data elements. So if you are in the receiving, you need a set of information in your documentation that may very well be already included on your documentation, and you might have to do certain modifications, the same with the shipping CTE. But because I don't know in detail your business, I can't tell you whether you are okay or you're not okay. So the Canadian companies that manufacture foods for the US market, I will have to read a little bit more of the exemption, but I haven't read anything that they are exempt. You know, like the for example, for the preventive controls of human foods, foods coming from Canada are exempt from the rule because the Canadian rules or the Canadian regulations are comparable to the US, the same with New Zealand and the same with Australia. I did not read, nor did I heard on any webinars that I have attended that this is from the FDA, that this is a exemption. So if there is not exemption for the Canadian companies, then you fall under the import foods and you need to comply with the rule based on the requirements. We mainly do avocados. Again, if you're not on the list, you might not fall on the rule. The date for the SCS workshop is January 31st, 2023. Our auditors are starting to SCS for GFSI looking for programs in the next year. No, they're not going to be looking for these programs next year, as far as I know, because they're going to be just mainly centered on the GFSI rule. Now you have to, or the GFSI standard. Now you have to remember that if you look at your standards, under food safety in some of them or all of them, you are required to comply with the regulatory requirements of the country of origin of the food. What does this mean? It doesn't say we're going to be looking for this in your traceability program, but it lets you interpret that you might have to revamp your traceability program based on the new rule. Again, I don't see how, if the FDA is not enforcing the rule at the moment, how that will be against your GFSI compliance, but you might have an improvement opportunity perhaps. Okay, I'm not an auditor, but that is my interpretation of the current state and the regulation. Hi, Tanya. Yes, I'll keep you informed on the watermelon one. The exemption list, actually, you have to read the rule for the exemption, and there is exemption within the exemption. So there is not a list per se of exempted. They talk about if you're a business, you know, if you are part of the preventive controls rules, there is exemptions, for example, of small businesses that insert a threshold of income or size. There is also egg farms that has less than 300,000 laying hens, for example, are exempt. So those are also part of exemption in this rule, but then there is also exemptions within the exemptions. There is partially exempt and full exempt. If a company exports fresh fruit, for example, this company receive a batch of products from different farms. How will it proceed with the GPS coordinates as one lot will be made? Okay, each of the farms will have to give you that information separately, and you need to keep the records. Okay, so the PowerPoint of the video, I can provide a 3 pages a PDF that we can send to your email. If your suppliers are under the rule, what additional documents do you need to request from them? Again, that depends on the key data elements. The list is very extensive. And just because you have a supplier, right, that you require that, then you also need to keep KDEs as a receiving entity, perhaps. And then if you're going to ship the transformed product or the product that you have made, now you have shipping KDEs. And again, the list is very extensive of documentation. They might. So will a cashew-based cheese spread fall under the category of nut butter? Seems like no, but if you have any insight, that will be appreciated. So I will have to go and look at the nut butter definitions that they provide, but it might fall under that nut, and I will, Greg, get back to you on that. I'm working with honey, organic, or if you're not in the rule, no, or on the food traceability list, I don't think honey is on the food traceability list, as far as I remember. How do we determine the key data elements that are needed? There is a list that has been into which you can identify those documentations. And again, it's very extensive. I will not mention them here because each CTE has its own N+. And so it's like, I'm going to run out of time if I do that. But they can be also found in the FDA website. We are an important company in Canada. We specialize in canned fish and canned fruit and vegetable products. As these are thermally processed products, does this mean we are exempt? If you are provided, if the products, so yeah, actually canned fish and canned fruit, if you're not the processor, you're just importing the foods, you most likely, because a kill step has been applied, you are exempt as a processor, but if you're an importer, you may have to provide shipping KDE's requirements, okay? Because in that, you become now a shipper, right? That will be your CTE. Does the traceability rule cover manufacturers that don't handle raw ingredients? For example, if all of the ingredients received by the manufacturer are either already transformed, processed, or dried, freeze-dried? Yes, it covers in the sense of receiving and shipping. And again, if you're receiving the raw agricultural commodity, then you have receiving KDEs. If it's already transformed, then you might have shipping KDEs that you need to address as the transform or as the processor. How can we sign for the workshop? Go to our website. We have already the link there for you guys to register. Yes, my slide will be available. I can actually have our team to email the PDF of my slides. Thank you. Yeah, I can send the information of the watermelon to all. I'm be sure that we download all these questions, but I'm making note in here. So you will find the exemptions, but not the exemptions within the exemptions. Again, you will have to read the rule and do a lot of interpretation. Yes, the video will be available to you and it will be emailed to you tomorrow. If you have the location on the GFSI Primus audits that provides the exact coordinates as to where the food is being grown, yes, it meets the requirements. All righty, thank you. That concludes all the questions, and it looks like I have few follow-ups, and I will be doing so in the next couple of days. So you guys have a great afternoon and the rest of the morning, and I will see you in the next webinar and hopefully in the workshop on the 31st of January. Have a good holidays and a happy new year.